All right, looks like everyone is in their seats and we're ready to get started on time. And we do appreciate you being here this morning. We're here this morning on December 8th, 2020 for an informal meeting called for by Rule 4D of the special rules governing the operation of rates Rsc and CMP for Alabama Power Company. Those rules call for Alabama Power to participate annually in an informal meeting where the commission, its staff, and any other interested party can discuss the company's most recent annual submission under rate Rsc, which was made this year on December 1, 2020. Interested parties were made aware of today's informal meeting pursuant to a commission notice that was issued on November 2nd, 2020. I'm John Garner, Chief Administrative Law Judge of the Public Service Commission. The format that we'll follow this morning is to first hear an overview of the most recent Rsc filing from Alabama Power Company. And that will be followed by questions from the commission staff and other interested parties after that. As far as the ground rules for participation beyond the staff, I will call on those individuals who indicated a desire to speak when they signed into the meeting this morning. When I call on you, you will need to come up to the podium directly in front of me to speak. If you are not at one of these tables and you're not at the podium, then you should not attempt to interject into the proceedings. I would also note that we're going to keep the discussions this morning confined to the intended purpose that we're here for, and that is to discuss the 2021 Rsc filing of Alabama Power. We are again pleased to have everyone in attendance today, both physically and via our live stream. Although we normally don't do so, the commissioners determined that today's meetings would be live streamed for the first time in light of the physical attendance challenges presented by the coronavirus pandemic. Because we are this year required to keep the number of physical attendees down to comply with all safety protocols and to ensure the well-being of those who are here presenting, the determination was made to live stream to ensure that interested parties who desire to observe these proceedings but were unable to attend due to health concerns had an opportunity to do so. Just as everyone else is, we are hopeful that future years will not present the physical attendance challenges that led us to live stream today. Let's hope for the vaccine sooner rather than later. In an effort to keep the number of physical attendees down, the commissioners have elected to observe today's presentations via the live stream instead of being here as they normally are. I would always point out to you, though, that the commissioners have been individually briefed by the staff on the filings that will be discussed today. And they will be in a position to delve into any questions or concerns that are raised in today's meetings through follow-up individual briefings and meetings with the staff. For those of you who are in attendance, we expect compliance with the participation protocols I discussed previously. We do have officers from ALEA here providing security should it be necessary to deal with any violations of those guidelines. Even though today's informal meeting is being live streamed due to the unusual circumstances we have this year, let me also note that since this is not a formal contested case hearing, it may be recorded so long as you do the recording in a manner that's not disruptive. I will now call on Mr. Dan McCrary, the attorney for Alabama Power, for an introduction of the individuals who will be speaking on behalf of the company this morning and an overview of the company's presentation.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Judge Garner. As indicated, in accordance with the special rules and with the Commission's notice issued November 2nd, this informal meeting is for the purpose of answering questions related to Alabama Power's submittal under rate Rsc for 2021. With me at the table today are Brian George and Bronson Kilgore.
Good morning. As Dan mentioned, my name is Brian George, and I'm an assistant treasurer with Alabama Power. I'm joined today by Bronson Kilgore. Bronson is a financial planning and budget manager for Alabama Power. Our primary area of responsibility is financial and corporate planning. Together, we will be discussing the company's 2021 Rsc filing. As indicated in the filing made on December the 1st, our 2021 Rsc weighted return on average retail common equity falls below the specified return range. As a result, the rate Rsc calculation produces an adjustment of approximately $228 million. When combined with the actions that occurred at last week's commission meeting, this increase, combined with a $103 million decrease in rate ECR, will result in a net increase of $125 million for 2021. Based on the company's current projection of retail electric revenues, the net adjustment will result in a 2% increase. We will now be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, let's begin with questions from the staff.
Good morning. I'm Patricia Smith, the Public Utility Analyst Manager of the Electricity Policy Division here at the Commission. I have with me Mr. Chad Mason. He is an attorney with our division, and he will be assisting with questions today. Under Title 37 of the Code of Alabama, the Commission is responsible for regulatory oversight of the rates and services of Alabama Power Company. In the execution of these duties, the Commission staff prepares financial analysis, economic evaluations, and statistical data assimilation. In addition, we present financial, operational, and management-related inquiries to Alabama Power Company to remain informed as to the manner and method in which the company conducts business. The staff expects and receives full and timely cooperation from Alabama Power Company in connection with such activities. The Commission's understanding of the company's operations and accounting practices facilitates our assessment of filing and information provided by the company. With this knowledge and perspective, we have prepared some questions related to rate Rsc on 2021 that will be of interest to those in attendance and via live stream. At this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Chad Mason to begin with the staff's questions.
Good morning. On December 1st, 2020, Alabama Power filed information and calculations required under rate Rsc and special rules governing the operation of rate Rsc with the Commission. The filing identified a rate adjustment for 2021, which is the first Rsc adjustment since 2017. Could you identify and elaborate on the primary drivers for the Rsc adjustment for 2021?
Repeat that question.
Yeah, there's an adjustment this year. Could you identify and elaborate on the primary drivers?
Sure. Three primary areas that we're going to highlight today during our discussion. The first would be additional new plant that's been placed in service in scheduled to be placed in service in 2021. That's approximately $1.4 billion in new plant that will be placed in service. In addition to that, there's increased operations and maintenance expenditures that will also be discussed today. And finally, we'll also be talking about revenues and that impact on the filing for 2021 as well. Those will be the three primary drivers for today's discussion.
The filing identifies that this adjustment equates to about a 4.09% increase to Rsc for 2021. How does this adjustment compare to previous years?
The rate has operated three times or twice over the last 10 years. In 2015, I believe the rate increase was around 3.5%. Going from memory on this, and then in 2017 it was around 4.5%. Across that 10-year period, those rate increases have averaged out to about 0.8% across the 10-year period for those two rate increases. Compared to inflation, that's about 1/2 of the CPI inflation rate for that same 10-year period of time.
Thank you. Could you explain the impact the adjustment will have on the bill of a typical residential customer using 1,000 kilowatt hours per month?
Yeah. The impact that I mentioned earlier, the net impact of the rate increase for RSC combined with the fuel decrease will result in approximately a 2% increase for the typical retail customer, and that's about $4 a month.
Thank you. Now I'd like to review some items from Appendix B, page 3, which includes the adjustment to the midpoint of the weighted equity return range for the 2021 file. During review of the 2021 RSC budget, the staff notes that the company's electric plant and services projected to increase in 2021 when compared to last year's file. Could you summarize what is driving this increase?
Yeah. The increase that you're referring to is the $1.4 million that I mentioned a little earlier.
Is that billion?
Did I misspeak?
I think you said billion.
Billion, sorry. 1.4 billion. Yeah, I mentioned the three primary areas there that are impacting the rate that included the 1.4 billion. Specifically in that 1.4 billion, there's 500 million in the area of production or generation. That 500 million is going to include items such as the purchase of Central Alabama, which was not contemplated in last year's budget filing. In addition to that, we've also got money that we're spending at Plant Berry that's in support of black start capability for Plant Farley, the nuclear plant. We've also included costs associated with normal steam retrofit projects that will occur as part of our planned outages in 2021. In the power delivery area, or transmission and distribution, there's approximately $590 million of increases in plant service that will come from that particular area. Two things of specific interest are a complete transmission substation rebuild, which will occur in the Birmingham area. It's the Bessemer Transmission Substation near Lakeshore Drive. The existing facility that's in place at this time is approximately 100 years old, and with that particular site is a complete rebuild of that transmission substation. In addition to that, we're also doing some work in the Anniston-Oxford area in support of the Honda manufacturing plant and other Tier 2 suppliers within that area. And that project is a transmission extension of 10 miles. It's going to go from the Corona Span facility to the Honda manufacturing facility. That particular area has experienced growth, which required this additional source of power to come from a different part of the transmission system. The flow needs for that particular area have necessitated that particular addition. Finally, there's two significant transmission projects. One is a 66-mile reconductoring of a transmission line for the Bassett Creek Ferry corridor. And then there's also a central corridor project that's underway. It will be a 90-mile transmission line rebuild. Finally, in the area of general plant, we'll be increasing plant service there by approximately $280 million in RSC. That includes a variety of different general projects that include the addition or replacement of fleet vehicles and rolling stocks and trailers, those types of things. We've also included in that area fiber optic communications equipment that will be added to the system. There are software projects that are included in that general plant area. That would include the renewal of our Microsoft Office contract and other software products like that. And then finally, there is just general plant projects and purchases that will occur just as part of the ordinary course of business. So combined, we're looking at $510 million of additions to plant and service in the production or generation area, $590 million in the power delivery, transmission and distribution area, and roughly $280 million in the general plant area.
Each year, Alabama Power submits budgets that include significant dollars for capital projects, for transmission and distribution improvements, software upgrades like you just mentioned, and other such projects. What process or procedures does the company have in place to ensure with a reasonable degree of certainty that the rates customers pay to fund these projects are reasonable, consistent, and even necessary?
We have policies and procedures in place to ensure that we're getting the best price that we possibly can. Any procurement above a $10,000 limit requires a competitive bidding process. And during that competitive bidding process, our request for proposals will go out to a variety of vendors for them to bid into that process. As part of that process, it's not simply price that we'll be considering, but also obviously vendor reputation and those types of things. But it's a very thorough approach to determining that we're getting the best possible product at the best possible price for customers. In addition to that, I would just add that Alabama Power buys a significant amount of materials and supplies every year. We're considered a large purchaser of equipment and supplies. Not only is Alabama Power a large purchaser of that equipment, but we're also part of the Southern Company system. So in most of our supply chain transactions, we're also able to benefit from having Georgia Power and Mississippi Power included in those purchases and procurement decisions. That combined buying power in the marketplace leads to favorable pricing for our customers.
Thank you. Now, you've already touched on this, but the company's filing projects an increase in construction work in progress in 2021. Is this increase related to construction at Unit 8 or Plant Berry?
Yes, it is. Specifically for construction work in progress balance, that's for Berry 8, it's going to be approximately $265 million. The work that's underway and included in that particular account and line item.
Thank you. The company also projects an increase in accumulated depreciation and amortization. Explain how that relates to the response regarding to the increase in electric plant.
Sure. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we've got $1.4 billion of new plant that's going into service in 2021 and projected to be going into service. Under normal accounting guidance and accounting rules, as those assets are placed in service, we will begin to then depreciate and amortize those assets over their remaining life. And as that asset is depreciated, the expenses that are recognized then hit the accumulated depreciation balance on the balance sheet. So just as you're seeing the increase in plant and service, you're also seeing an increase in the accumulated depreciation over time as those assets are depreciated under the normal course of business.
In mid-August 2020, Alabama Power acquired Central Alabama Generating Facility. Please elaborate on the impact of the acquisition on the company's operation, including the impact of Line 5 of electric plant acquisition adjustments.
The Line 5 electric plant acquisition adjustment, there's a FERC accounting standard that's in place for that particular account that requires that a portion of the original purchase price of the Central Alabama plant be included in this particular account. So once that acquisition was completed, that portion of the acquisition price was included in this particular account, and that dollar amount will be amortized over the life of the Central Alabama plant. So that's the big increase that you're seeing there as a result of the acquisition of Central Alabama and the following of the FERC accounting standards to record that entry.
Now, my final question is related to Appendix B, page 3, is a two-part question. As noted in prior RSC meetings, the company has indicated that it's increasing the amount of equity in its capital structure. First, could you provide a brief description of your common equity projections for 2021 as highlighted in lines 21 and 25 of the Rsc Filing? And secondly, Why is the equity percentage of the company's total capitalization such an important component to the company's financial integrity?
Mr. George, before you answer that question, would you make sure you speak directly into the microphone and you're a little closer to it?
Yeah, I'm gonna move it a little closer.
Yep, that'd be good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So we are projecting an increase in common equity for 2021. And that is roughly about $840 million. That increase in equity is coming primarily from an equity contribution from Southern Company to Alabama Power, and that dollar amount is roughly $575,000. In addition to that, you've also got miscellaneous paid in capital and also retained earnings that will add up to that total of $840 million increase. We're projecting an equity percentage at the end of 2021 of approximately 52%. And you asked specifically about why that was important. There's probably not any single measure of a company's financial integrity that's more important than the equity percentage as a percentage of the company's total capitalization. And the reason the rating agencies evaluate that particular metric, that particular quantitative metric, is because they appreciate the fact that that equity investment in the increase in that equity percentage goes toward strengthening the company's financial quality and financial integrity. Companies that have a lower percentage of equity relative to their total capitalization are viewed as a riskier investment by the rating agencies and are thus rated lower typically than customers that have a higher equity percentage as their overall mix of total capitalization. So the rating agencies obviously view that favorably. As you well know, the Commission has directed the company to begin proceeding towards an equity percentage of 55%. The feedback that we've received from the rating agencies has been that that is viewed positively by them. And as I mentioned a little earlier, we are at 52%, or anticipating to be at 52% by year end. So we are well on our way to moving towards that 55% equity percentage of total capitalization.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have, and I'll turn it back over to Ms.
One
Smith.
correction on that, I believe you said the equity contribution was $575,000. I think it's
I'm sorry, $575,000.
Just want to make sure that was correct.
Judge, I'm sorry, I'm obviously, I hope it's just a fatigue factor and not something else, but you're right, it's $575 million. Thank you for that.
That all from staff?
That's all I have. No, Ms. Smith has a few more questions.
All right, thank you. Mr. Mason reviewed some items from page 3. Now let's turn to page 4 of Appendix B and the following. The first line item is the company's sales of electricity, which is projected to increase approximately $174 million in 2021 as compared to 2020. Could you explain what is driving this increase in revenues?
Sure, we go back to the $174 million increase is due to a combination of two things. One is retail revenues increasing by approximately $185 million, offset by a decrease in wholesale revenues of approximately $11 million. The retail revenue increase of $185 million is primarily driven by the Rsc adjustment that Brian mentioned earlier of $228 million, offset by a decrease in projected base rate revenues. Additionally, other retail revenues are projected to increase approximately $16 million. And the combination of all those is the $184 million or $185 million retail revenue increase.
What is the company's load forecast for 2021, and how does this compare to the load forecast in last year's filing?
The load forecast for 2021 as compared to the load forecast in last year's filing is lower, primarily driven by the near-term effects of COVID as well as energy efficiency improvements.
Thank you. Moving to projected expenses for 2021, could you provide a brief summary of the year-over-year change in non-fuel operation and maintenance expenses recovered in rate Rsc?
Sure, the non-fuel O&M expenses that are recovered through RC are projected to increase approximately $60 million. Of that $60 million, $20 million associated with outages. This $20 million increase in outage costs is driven by an increase of scope of routine maintenance outages to maintain system reliability. In addition to this, as Brian mentioned earlier, the acquisition of the addition of the acquisition of Central Alabama, there's an additional $14 million of O&M expenses associated with that plant. There's a $16 million increase associated with medical and other benefit costs, as well as a $13 million increase in the uncollectible account expense. So the combination of those is approximately $60 million.
And that's majority dealing with the COVID virus?
Which
Which
one?
of those, the decreases you said in injuries, medical expenses?
Yes, a couple. So the medical expenses, a portion of that is due to deferral of procedures from 2020 to 2021. Additionally, the uncollectible accounts is driven by increases that we've seen this year in uncollectible accounts.
Thank you. Recognizing that the utility sector is highly capital intensive, the company over the past few years has been increasing the amount of equity in its capitalization, which Mr. George mentioned just a few minutes ago. Could you explain then what is driving the decrease noted in interest expense as shown on line 21?
Sure, there's a $5 million decrease in interest expense. Primary driver of that is associated with our variable rate pollution control bonds and other debt securities that we have priced at variable rates. That contributes to approximately $20 million decrease as compared to last year's filing. Approximately 11% of the company's debt is priced at a variable rate, with the remaining price at a fixed rate. Offsetting the decrease is approximately $16 million of additional debt expense attributable to debt that we issued this year of approximately $600 million in two debt issuances that we have planned for next year. I think this is, the net decrease is a tangible benefit, as Brian mentioned, about our credit quality, being able to have lower interest expense.
Thank you.
I've never accused you of being soft-spoken.
Sorry.
I have just a few final questions. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact people and communities throughout Alabama and the world. What specific impact has this pandemic had on the company's operation in 2020, and what is the projected impact of this pandemic on 2021 operations?
Well, you're right, it certainly impacted everyone in the state of Alabama, and it has certainly affected our company and how we've operated since March of 2020. As far as operations practices, beginning in March of 2020, the company adopted CDC-endorsed COVID protective work practices within our plant locations and our company locations across the state. And that's included such things as limiting the access to our plant sites and our business locations for as far as the number of employees and the number of contractors that are on the site. We've also obviously adopted a significant amount of cleaning and hygienic practices within work sites and job sites to try to eliminate the risk of the virus spreading within a company location. Obviously, that's geared towards two groups primarily, the first being our employees, the second being our customers as well. In March of 2020, we also closed our business offices, which limited access there. Those business offices that did have drive-through locations were able to remain open and interact with customers through the drive-through facilities. In addition, we had at some business office locations a kiosk, electronic kiosk that provided for an avenue for payment of bills and those types of things. Within our power delivery group, they've been very busy this year with storm recovery, as you would expect, given the recent headlines. But even going back to March and April, we had a significant amount of storm activity. And in that particular case, the power delivery employees were asked to, again, adopt those same protective measures. And that's included wearing a mask, obviously working to the level and degree they can separate, work 6 feet apart while they're working on power delivery facilities or equipment and those types of things. Those practices have been adopted. We have reopened our business offices. As we've reopened those business offices, obviously we've adopted some practices, some equipment there that would include requiring people to wear a mask in the office. We've constructed plexiglass screens and shields to help protect our customer service reps as they're interacting with customers. Again, we've managed to find a way to work around this, and at this point in time, roughly 60% of our employees are working at their job sites as they were prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, and approximately 40% of our employees are working remotely from home. So obviously it's had a significant impact on our work practices and how we've operated the business.
Thank you. Following on the COVID pandemic, Alabama Power decided, with the commissioners in agreement, to place a moratorium on service disconnections, which temporarily offered customers some relief from having their electricity cut off during this pandemic. Could you provide an overview of this process and discuss with us if the postponement of disconnection is expected to impact the company's operations in 2021?
Yeah, obviously, one thing we've tried to do everything we possibly could to avoid disconnections, and that for that period of time, you're right, we did suspend those disconnections. Throughout that entire period of time, we encouraged our customers and reached out to them to contact us if they were having problems paying their power bill. And that was an effort to work with the customer to find a solution to help them be able to maintain their service. A number of customers have selected the installment payment plans as a means to pay their balance over a multi-month period of time. In addition to that, the company has worked with a number of local community action committees and teams to look for ways where federal funding under the various legislative acts that occurred could be used and brought to bear for customers to help them pay their bills. Specifically, there's a funding device through the federal government called LIHEAP, which is Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. So we've participated in working with those community outreach organizations to make them aware of that funding availability. In addition to that, the company's foundation and charitable business trust has contributed $1 million to communities across the state of Alabama to assist in pandemic relief. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to highlight there. Again, really just encouraging customers that do have issues to reach out to their customer service reps in the local business offices, and let's work together to see if we can find a solution, because at the end of the day, what we're really trying to avoid is having to disconnect the customer.
Are you noticing more customers using the installment plans this year as compared to previous years?
Well, we've never really had that formal installment payment plan in place before. We've obviously worked with customers in the past to keep their service provided and worked, through informal channels to be able to make that work. We have, through mid-November, the last time I checked, we had approximately 116,000 installment payment plans that have been put in place across that period of time.
Thank you. In addition to the pandemic, we experienced an extremely active hurricane season in 2020. Could you provide an update on the impact of Hurricanes Sally and Zeta on Alabama Power Service territory, and summarize the company's restoration efforts following these two major events.
Sure, I actually brought a, slide to help on that. So you're right, in 2020, two major hurricanes came ashore in Alabama. Hurricane Sally on September the 16th of 2020 and Hurricane Zeta on October the 29th of 2020. Sally, we had 680,000 customers affected. And with Zeta, we had 625,000 customers impacted by that storm. I'll point out again, those two storms occurred within 43 days of each other, which is significant to think that those two storms and storms of that magnitude have come ashore that close. The number of external resources that were brought to bear in addition to company employees was approximately 3,650 for Hurricane Sally and 4,258 outside resources brought in as part of Hurricane Zeta storm recovery. For the Sally storm, the total length of restoration was 4 days, and for Hurricane Zeta, it was 9 days. Back in 2004 and 2005, I was working in our fuel services area of the company at that time, and so thinking back over history, those two storms, Ivan and Katrina, reminded me somewhat of the impact of Sally and Zeta. Those two storms actually were 12 months apart. Ivan came ashore on September 16th of 2004. Katrina came ashore on August 29th of 2005. Both of those storms were similar in size and similar in magnitude to the damage and number of customers impacted as what we saw with Sally and Zeta. However, where I mentioned earlier, it took 13 days of combined storm recovery to get customers back online. Looking back at that period of 2004 and 2005, those two storms required 19 days to get customers back and restore service to the customers that could take service. So again, I think this most recent activity is representative of the Herculean effort that our storm delivery team was able to provide in getting customers back online as quickly as they could. Just an interesting story of the size of Zeta, just the geographic coverage of that storm. I have a friend who has a cabin in northeast Alabama, and there was actually tree damage on his property in northeast Alabama. You know, you would always tend to think of hurricane damage being mostly a coastal type event, but in the case of Zeta, that storm came ashore and was still a significant storm even once it got into northeast Alabama and the state of Georgia. It was still a significant hurricane at that point in time. Big storm.
Thank you. Judge Garner, that concludes the question we prepared for today. And these questions will be submitted to the company for written responses. In addition, we plan to submit several additional data requests as we continue to review the 2021 Rsc budget. And that concludes our report.
All right, if there's nothing further from staff, let's go ahead and move on to questions from interested parties. I believe we have 3 individuals who have signed up to propound some questions to the company. The first of those is Mr. Stephen Stetson of Sierra Club. Mr. Stetson, I see you're making your way to the podium. While you're doing that, let me just give a little bit of additional instruction. We do more questions, not statements, and the questions need to relate to the 2021 or 2021 Rsc Filing. With that, go ahead, Mr. Stetson.
Good morning, Judge Garner. Just as a procedural question, Judge Garner, is there going to be a subsequent presentation by environmental compliance issues? I want to be sure that I'm limiting these questions to the RSC.
Yes, it will commence probably immediately after this proceeding is concluded.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for your presentation. In response to the question, you hear me okay? Put my mask on. Here? Green light. Green light means go. Thanks y'all for your presentation. In response to a question by Mr. Mason, I understood Mr. George, I believe it was, to say that the purchase of the Central Alabama gas plant facility was not contemplated in last year's filing. But we were here back in March for proceedings related to that capacity expansion proposal that was filed in September of 19. And those proceedings about these kind of proceedings about rate Rsc were last year in December at this time. So my question is, why was the purchase of a gas-fired power plant that y'all knew you were trying to buy not considered in last year's proceedings?
And just a question, are we asking about last year's filing? Do I understand the question?
I'm asking why in this year's filing is the first time we're hearing about the inclusion of the Central Alabama facility.
The reason it wasn't included in last year's filing is we didn't have the necessary approval to be able to include it in the Rsc filing. It was subject to a certification process that was ongoing at that point in time. And without the necessary approval from the commission, we could not include it in the Rsc filing.
Thank you. So, this is a different subject. I just wanted to clear that up in response to that information surfacing. So, I think it was Mr. Kilgore said in response to Ms. Smith that, and correct me if I got this number wrong, is it $13 million in uncollectible debt?
That's correct, that's the increase in this year's RC budget.
And is that across customer classes? So some of that is residential, some of that is industrial, et cetera?
That's right, that's total.
So we know that these rates and demand are interrelated, and as you said, it's decreased load across those customer classes as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, there's a decrease in load in this year's filing.
So a lot of those folks, we know there's a lot of folks out there that are falling behind on their bills, and some folks are going to catch up on a payment plan. I believe you made reference to a payment plan, and some of that debt is uncollectible. So let me ask my question this way. I guess I have a couple questions about that. One is, in Georgia, we get monthly accounting from Georgia Power on disconnections and uncollectible debt, and I'm wondering what data Alabama Power makes public in this area aside from this once-a-year proceeding.
We're getting a little bit far afield from the purposes that we're here. I realize you're asking your question in response to a question that was proposed by staff, but that was a pretty general question getting down into the information that's provided. We can talk about what's in the budget and why it's there, but beyond that, that's beyond the scope of the proceeding.
Okay, maybe I could ask you this way. Well, you can just tell me that is this or is this not the only opportunity we have to know about uncollectible debt that y'all have as a result of this decreased load from COVID?
Again, this relates to the filing that was made and the $13 million that's in the budget.
Okay.
Beyond that, we're not going to talk process and get into that today. That's beyond the scope of our review.
Okay, maybe I can ask just another question about the payment plans then. I understand what the final number is. Did I correctly hear you say it's 116,000 folks are on installment payment plans now in the past year?
That was the number as of mid-November.
Okay, starting from previous January, so it's almost a full year.
Probably started in the March, April timeframe.
So I guess my question about this filing is that is that window closed? If folks who are behind on their bills due to the economic contraction due to the pandemic, if they wanted to sign up for a payment plan, is that window closed for them?
The window is closed in the sense that it's no longer an online feature. Again, what I mentioned earlier is I would continue to encourage our customers to reach out to their customer service contacts. If they are having issues paying their bills, the company will seek opportunities to help find solutions for those problems.
Sure. And this may be a bit granular, but it's a 6-month repayment plan?
That was 4 months, as I recall.
Appreciate that. I think the only other thing I have, Your Honor, is just appreciate the live streaming of these proceedings for folks at home, even though they may be watching and can't ask questions themselves. And just wanted to note that we exposed ourselves to some risk to be here, and would appreciate if commission staff would require the folks in the audience, everybody to wear a mask at this time. That would make me feel a lot safer sitting out in the audience.
I think everybody has their mask on as I'm looking around, so,
Thanks a lot.
yes, sir. All right, that brings us to Mr. Daniel Tate, Energy Alabama. And let me just say that I have less exposure here than I do when I go to the grocery store. So we try to observe all the protocol. We've been back working here full-time since May 1, and we really have not had any issues, so.
Let me put in the personal plug for the pickup, just because it's great for kids. Thank y'all for being here. A few questions that I have this morning, getting right into it. Are you able to provide there's kind of two calculations or numbers that I'm interested in. Alabama Power's general return on equity and also Alabama Power's return on common equity?
This process is not governed by return on equity, we're governed by weighted cost of equity, so you need to keep your questions to that format.
That is information included in the filing, though, not correct?
It's weighted cost of equity, Mr. Tate. The filing is public, I think you'll find that weighted cost of equity.
Interesting, thank you, sir. Let's see, next question. You mentioned about I think you were talking about a specific line, but this was in relation to the Anniston area, the transmission upgrade that was taking place, I believe, around the Honda manufacturing line and plant. And I don't think you were necessarily talking about that one particular plant, but other upgrades that were happening in that area because of influx of suppliers and things of that nature. And so my question is, you mentioned those increases for transmission upgrades and things that were happening. That was included as a part of the Rsc filing, the upgrade, the increase, if you will, to the Rsc that we're seeking today. Do the customers on the other end of those lines bear any responsibility above and beyond regular customers? Like, I guess my question is, who is bearing the responsibility for the extension of the grid services to specific plants? So, for instance, if the Honda was the one you were talking about, and you have a Honda line, does Honda bear the responsibility for that, or is that shared across the general rate class we see here, recovered via Rsc?
Well, that particular line is intended to serve all of the customers within that Anniston-Oxford area, so that would include any industrial or commercial customers that are directly interconnected to that system, in addition to the distribution customers that are served within that area as well. So I'm not intimately knowledgeable of that particular area, but having driven in that area, I know there's also residential customers, so all three classes of customers, residential, commercial, and industrial, would likely be benefiting from that improved power quality within that area.
That helps. So to make sure I understand exactly kind of what you're saying, you're saying these are transmission upgrades that are happening kind of not necessarily directly to an end-use customer, but for the transmission system, benefiting the entire area and of Anniston, or in that particular example you were talking about earlier. Is that correct?
Power flow, power quality within that entire geographic area. And let me be clear, I'm an accountant and not an engineer, so.
I understand. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of draw the distinction there between responsibility and like what we're seeing for transmission versus, as you stated, more distribution level, direct to a specific customer. Thank you, sir. Next question was around, you mentioned an additional item increasing because of kind of turnover of some fleet and vehicles that were aging. And as you know, Southern Company itself at the parent level has pretty aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal. And I guess my question is, when you're looking at those, is the company looking at replacing those vehicles with electric transportation that you would then use your own electrons you're generating and help with the things we're seeing in this filing?
I don't know that I know the answer to that question. I would assume if there is that level of technology available, I guess, in the form of transportation equipment. It's economically practical to be able to do that, I would assume so. And I just, unfortunately, I know we have a lot of trucks and a lot of trailers that we utilize throughout. I don't have any specific knowledge about how much of that might be electrified transportation equipment.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the rising equity over time. I think some questions from staff as well, that roughly you said 52 would be the target at year end. Did I hear that correct?
Where we're expecting to be, right?
Okay. And you mentioned that this would be again, check my figure here, about an $840 million total common equity increase. You mentioned $575 million was from an injection from Southern Company parent level. Is that about right? Okay. And then you also mentioned there was some discussion, I think, from some questions about, equity being an extremely important part of the risk profile, if you will, of the company. And I guess my question is, can you help explain the balance or the decision matrix, if you will, that determines why 52 would be the target as opposed to 55 or 75? If equity is such an important part of de-risking the company, what lends itself to that particular target as opposed to other equity targets?
Well, again, we've got a goal, I believe, to be at 55% by 2025, so we are ratably increasing that over a period of time. And since 2018, we've increased that equity percentage about 6.5% to the 52% that we have now. So we are well on our way to getting to the 55%. I think it's just really a question of how much are we spending, what's the cash flows of the business, and what's a reasonable timeline, given our financial needs, to be able to get to that 55% target.
Maybe a different way to ask the question or to follow on to that, and thank you for that, it's very helpful. What would be the benefits of higher, so your current target is 55, as you mentioned, what would be the benefits of an even higher equity target than that in terms of the financial health of the company?
Going beyond 55%?
Yeah, I guess my question is, if the target were 60, right, or I'm just making any number higher than 55, would that be beneficial in terms of the filing we're looking at today, like for this and future filings, that number would have been 55 or 60 or 65? Would that have benefited the company and our customers to be in a higher equity position? Because as we're raising, I'm assuming there's some benefit there over time, so I wonder why we stop at 55.
I think 55% to be is a reasonable level of equity investment in the business at this point in time. There are utilities with more equity, but at this point in time, given the balance of equity and debt in the business, that seems like a fair spot to land, given the goal of maintaining our credit quality.
Would you agree with the assertion that debt is at an all-time low in terms of cost?
Sure.
It's cheaper to borrow money now than it has been.
Mr. Kilgore pointed out that we had $600 million of debt back in August at 1.45, right?
That's correct. $600 million, I mentioned earlier, we issued at 1.45%.
Excellent, that's really low.
In fact, it's an all-time low for the tenor for Southern Company and at Alabama Power as well.
Yeah, that's really low. Excellent. And in terms of the cost of debt versus the cost of equity, that debt is cheaper, it's a lower rate, is that correct?
Cost of debt is less expensive than cost of equity.
That's right. So the higher the equity percentage, the lower the debt, it's slightly more costly. But you mentioned earlier that it may be more costly, but there's a benefit of, quote, de-risking the company. Did I get that right?
I think, and maybe you want to jump in here some as well, I think there's a recognition that even though we're increasing the equity amount, there's a benefit to customers overall, through the overall cost of running the business and financing the business. So we're balancing that out as we go and trying to make sure we're making the right informed decisions for customers to provide the lowest cost of financing the business.
Let me follow up on that, make sure I understand what you said there correctly. You're saying that equity is more expensive than debt, especially in today's environment, and we saw some, excellently cheap debt that was being able to be issued here recently, but that there is a benefit to customers by issuing more expensive equity. Can you help explain what might be happening there that would actually drive a benefit to customers on that front?
Well, let's talk about the company's overall financial integrity and its credit rating and how that benefits customers. One, it does provide a benefit to customers in the form of lower borrowing costs. That same financial integrity and credit rating provides access to credit markets when financial turmoil might be in place. So it provides us an avenue to be able to borrow money when we need to borrow money in the financial markets. Finally, I think the financial integrity of the company creates a demand for our investment vehicles from investors. So all of this is being done in such a way that it is intended to maintain the company's strong financial integrity and provide benefits to customers.
Let's move on to a slightly different topic. You mentioned this may be some responses to questions from staff, so my apologies if I'm getting this a little mixed up, but there was some discussion, I shall say, about non-fuel O&M going up slightly. Did I have that correctly? It was like 60 million or something like that?
That's correct.
And I just wanted to ask, so, I listen in to earnings calls for Southern Company, and I have here recently been hearing, Southern Company CEO and other leadership with Southern Company talking about driving O&M down, largely in response to coronavirus, some of the things we've been talking about today because of the cash crunch or financial pressures that may put on the company. And, he's been talking about reductions in O&M across the entire fleet. So I'm trying to help understand if, there are other reductions in O&M that he may be talking about, what's the dichotomy there? Y'all can help me understand. You're saying that non-fuel O&M.
Well, I think, we're here talking about 2021 expenditures.
Okay, so you're talking about the future, and he's talking about something that occurred in this year.
That's right, we're talking about the filing, and then the costs are included in the filing here.
Okay, so you're talking about non-fuel O&M going up, so we expect a $60 million increase for next year.
Compared to last year's filing.
And how's this year in comparison? So you would say that Alabama Power is this year is down. Is that correct?
Your Honor, if I may, again, we're talking about the filing, not this year's actual, so I think we're out of scope.
Yeah, I might be a little confused about the question. It does need to pertain to this year's filing, so if you have a question related to that, then certainly.
Yeah, the question is just basically, and I think you may have helped me answer it, but just, I'm hearing that Southern Company is trying to lower operation and maintenance expenses in large part because of, the financial pressures associated with coronavirus. And then you're saying that, while that may be true, the filing that you have in front of us today is projecting an increase by $60 million in non-fuel O&M, but that's for next year, starting in January 1 of 2021. Is that correct?
Yes, but what we're here to talk about is the 2021 filing, or the filing for year 2021.
Okay, thank
Which
you.
projects an increase.
A couple more questions, and then I think I will have reached the end of my list. You mentioned earlier that there was about $13 million in uncollectible increase. Is that right? That's from previous years on average?
Compared to last year's.
Compared to last year. And did I hear that right? There was 116,000 people. Was that in reference to people who had taken you up on the offer of a payment plan?
That's correct.
Do we have any numbers or any information about what's driving the 13 million uncollectible? Is 116,000 that you referenced all captured in that $13 million uncollectible revenue? Or are there additionals that we know of that may not be, signed up for our payment plan, if you will?
It's driven by, experiences that we've seen this year with an increase in uncollectible accounts, increase in past due amounts as well, so it's driving that increase.
Okay,
So
but,
that's a general expense in every year's budget.
correct.
Bad debt expense is sort of a recognized business expense. We've certainly experienced a higher bad debt expense this year, given the impact of the coronavirus on customers. And what we've done is tried to anticipate some near-term carryover of that into 2021, and that's what's resulting in the $13 million increase from last year's budget and filing to this year's budget and filing.
Does the company have any plans in 2021 to write off any debt associated with these delinquent customers above and beyond what is normally the plan, as you mentioned, for, like, there's always uncollectible accounts, there's always end up being some write-offs and things of that nature. Is that being also increased in the 2021 filing?
I think this
This is a reflection of it.
Yeah, that 13 million is the recognition of the write-off of those
So
accounts.
that's assumed to be not just uncollectible, but will be written off.
Right.
That's something assumed. I know there'll be an actual that will true it up and things of that nature, but that's the current assumption, is that right?
That's the assumption for 2020.
Okay. And then I have one final question. This is switching gears a little bit, but there was some discussion about the purchase of Central Alabama and the addition of Plant Berry Unit 8 into effectively the rate base of Alabama Power. And I guess I wondered, is there any difference in the way that the company treats certain assets that are under more of a power purchase agreement as opposed to things that are new power plant construction, as opposed to other things that you're buying a power plant in terms of how that's calculated in the rate base? Does that make sense?
It does. So the acquisition of Central Alabama is unique. When we bought Central Alabama back in August, we also assumed an existing power sale agreement. So the full output of that facility is dedicated to a third party through mid-2023. So during the time period, we're going to be collecting revenues associated with that power purchase agreement. Those revenues are included in the filing on line 7. Those revenues will exceed the cost that both Brian and I talked about on the capital side or O&M side and other costs as well. So Central Alabama was unique in that there's a power purchase agreement associated with it through mid-2023, and that covers the cost.
Thank you, sir. And that is estimated to have a net benefit to customers because the value, if you will, of the existing power purchase agreement is above and beyond what you're projecting for the cost to operate the plant.
That's exactly right. The revenues are exceeding the cost of the facility.
Okay, very good. And that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Next, we have Mr. Keith Johnston from SELC.
Hello, I'm Keith Johnson. I'm the director of the Southern Environmental Law Center in the Birmingham office. Thank you for the presentation today. I appreciate that. I want to go back to some of your testimony where you discussed the load forecast, and you said there was a decrease in the load forecast this coming year, projected. What percentage roughly did you estimate? I think last year you said there was an increase in load forecast of roughly 1%, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so for 2021 as compared to 2020, the load forecast is projected to decrease approximately 3%.
And what are the drivers of that?
The primary driver is in the industrial segment. So the industrial load is about 65% of that decrease. So that's the near-term effect of COVID on, industrial demand and industrial expansions.
Is that, do you project that out beyond the next year?
And I'm just here to talk,
2021?
about 2021
What
and
do
what's
you-
in the filing.
Do you normally do those sorts of projections?
Not for the filing. No.
But do you normally do them?
Yeah, I normally do them, no, you know,
You don't project out past the next year?
no.
And then you were talking about the 1.4 billion, I think you said, that is going to plant and service this year, and part of that includes Central Alabama, is that correct?
Yes.
And then you discussed this Berry project called, I kind of missed that, was that Black Star?
There is an NRC requirement for Plant Farley for it to have, to be able to basically, in the event of a blackout, to have a source of generation from outside of the plant site that can repower the nuclear unit and get it back up and running following a blackout event. Right now, the asset that currently supports Plant Farley is located at Plant Smith in Florida and part of Gulf Power. With the sale of Gulf Power to Florida Power and Light, that system asset will no longer be a part of the southern system. So we are putting in reciprocating engines at Plant Berry, which would facilitate the ability of Plant Berry to resume power within the plant site and get those units up and running, and those units within Plant Berry would then be used as the resource for a Black Start operation at Plant Farley.
Black Star.
The reference was to the Black Start capability at Plant Berry and the assets required to be able to do that at Plant Berry in support of Plant Farley.
And so are those auxiliary units at Berry?
Again, I'm an accountant. From what I understand, you have to be able to get Plant Berry up and running physically, assuming you don't have any other source of power from outside to get Plant Berry up and running. Once Plant Berry is up and running, those assets would then be used to repower the nuclear facility in the event of a complete blackout across the system.
And what are those units at Plant Berry? Do you know? Right.
Do I know which?
What are
units?
those units? Are those new units or are those existing units?
As far as the Black Start?
Correct.
I've probably exhausted my technical know-how at this point in time.
And on Plant Farley, did the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just increase the load at Plant Farley?
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission just increased.
Just authorize an increase in the electrical generation at Plant Farley?
Yeah, I think we've been doing some work there that's resulted in, what you're speaking to, I think the work we've done at Plant Farley has resulted in additional megawatts.
Right, that's what I'm asking. And do you know the increase in those megawatts?
Recall somewhere in the, and I'm grabbing this from memory, I was going to say somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 8 to 15, something in that range from the upgrade.
And will that decrease load or generation across the Alabama Power System for 2021? Decrease, will that increase in electrical generation at Farley decrease the amount of electrical generation at existing units on Alabama Power
It will
System?
be available to serve the customers of Alabama Power.
You discussed another part of that 1.4 billion plant in service was this transmission extension from Kronospan, I believe you said, to Honda. And what is that extension? Is Kronospan the generator there?
Now, Kronospan is a industrial customer. It's just a location along the system. The transmission system is the starting point for this line extension. It's a 10-mile line from that particular facility to the Honda manufacturing plant.
So it's basically just the nodule or the spoke for the extension.
Again, I'm an accountant, but there's a power flow that operates in that area, and this will be a second source of power into that particular area through the transmission system.
And you had also mentioned the construction work in progress that is part of this plant and service at Berry Unit 8. And I think you said that was $265 million for 2021, correct?
Yes, at the end of 2021.
And for work that's what's the work underway?
Unit A. We're beginning construction of the plant.
Any more details than that?
Well, again, he's here for the accounting purposes, so we're getting beyond the scope of what he's prepared for. So when you get into that granularity.
Also, you had mentioned, one of you, and I apologize for not remembering which, but I think in response to questions, a decrease in wholesale sales, is that correct? I have that correct?
That's correct.
And what's the driver behind the decrease in those wholesale sales?
There's several factors. One is a decrease in the load from wholesale customers, and also the wholesale customers providing additional resources. So procuring less from Alabama Power.
And what are those additional resources that they're providing?
I'm not familiar with what all resources they have available for these customers.
Those are generation from those wholesale
Yeah, they're providing additional,
suppliers.
right, from another third party, as an example.
And you said, and this is relating back to the load forecast, but you had talked about energy efficiency improvements. What exactly what were you thinking of there?
For like residential, lighting, appliance efficiencies. Same way with commercial class as well. Go ahead.
Go ahead, finish it off.
So those are the main drivers there: lighting, appliances, HVAC units.
And is that's being driven just by the customers themselves investing in those energy efficiency measures?
That's correct.
Is that any sort of program from Alabama Power that's pushing those energy efficiency measures?
It's a combination. We do have, roughly 15 energy efficiency programs to encourage, customers, to look for energy efficiency options.
And do you have the metrics on how those programs are operating?
Not specifically, I don't. I speak for myself. I participate in one, and I get a $25 bill credit every year. Last year when I received my bill credit, my bill for the month was $40, so it worked well for me.
Turning to this is in the written analysis portion of the operation of rate RSE. And you say there, this is the back of the filing, I think. You say there the WRRCE for 2021 is also impacted by near-term effects of COVID-19, which have negatively affected revenue. The cumulative effects of these and other pressures on both cost projections and revenues cause the company's WRRCE to be below RSE range, thereby triggering operation of rate. I just want to clarify something really quickly. I'm sure this is just something that I'm missing, but I would like to know the answer to it. In the November 20 agenda to the December meeting, the regular PSC meeting, the RSE forecast for the 12 months ending in December 31st, 2020 was 6.76%. How does that, what am I missing here with the WRRCE for the end of December 2020 in this filing was 5.95%?
I think the number you're referring to is year-to-date results in 2020.
Okay, so those were actual.
Year-to-date actual results.
Are you talking about on the commission filing, the commission December meeting? The 6.76%?
Would have been a calculated return based on operations through the month of October at that point in time.
Okay, so that's through October, and in the actual filing, the filing that we're discussing, the RSE today, is 5.95%, correct,
That was last year's,
for 2020.
was 5.95%, correct?
And but the commission filing is 6.7%, that's just through October, did it?
We're not done 2020. We've still got a couple of months of actuals to record, and then the rate will operate as it's designed to operate at the end of the year, so.
I'm just trying to understand that difference,
What
why,
you've got there is a point-in-time estimate based on year-to-date results.
at that 6.76%, that's what you're saying. And the filing here is still projected at 5.75?
The filing we made for 2021 is solving to a 605.
Okay. But I'm just trying to get, because it says test for 12 months ending December 2020.
Right. That was last year's.
5.95.
That was last year's filing.
Your Honor, if I may, we really are confusing apples and oranges here. Mr. Johnson is referring to the current reporting for year 2020, partially actual, partially budgeted for the balance of the year, which is completely different than the projection for 2021 as reflected in the filing, which is what we're here about today.
I think he's trying to understand that.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. Thank you, Mr. McCreary, I appreciate it, but I still don't really understand the 5.95%.
That was last year's
Okay,
filing and the resulting WRRCE that came from that filing.
okay.
So what you've got on the right-hand side is last year's filing,
Okay,
for the year-end projection, and then what you've got on the left-hand side is pre-RSE action, the information that's provided in support of that filing.
The right-hand side is what we were here discussing last year. The left column is what we're discussing today.
I got you. Okay, so so test for the 12 months ending December 2020 was a projection
Just like today's projection.
from last year, and the commission meeting set 6.76% was an actual through October.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay,
10 months actual, 2 months.
that's all I was trying to do. Sorry to make that more difficult than it was. Okay, so back to that, what I just read from you from the filing for today. I assume that when you say other pressures or cost projections, and I'll just read it to you again so you know what I'm talking about. You said the cumulative effects of these and other pressures on both cost projections and revenues cause the company's WRRCE to be below the RSE range, thereby triggering operation of the rate. What are the other pressures on cost projections?
The other costs that aren't specifically mentioned here, or maybe previously, depreciation costs, associated with the plant and service that Brian mentioned of the $1.4 billion, there are also depreciation costs associated with that, property taxes associated with those investments as well.
It would basically be everything else that's on that page 2 that we didn't talk about specifically in this paragraph.
And then you said that the near-term effects of COVID-19 have negatively affected revenue. I assume that means revenue has gone down because of the near-term effects of COVID-19.
That's correct.
And then what are your forecasts for revenue for the next year? I mean, are they still affected by COVID-19 revenue?
For 2021?
2021, correct?
Yep. And that's what we've been talking about, here, as I was mentioning earlier, the load, it's talking about, the load impact is for 2021, so the revenues are down as well, and that's approximately $50 million decrease from last year's filing.
And what about those long-term effects?
Like I mentioned earlier, the filing is just for 2021, and that's what we're here to talk about, is the load forecast for, it's embedded in the filing here. It is worth mentioning, though, that, as I mentioned, that, one of the primary drivers of the decrease in industrial load, we maintain, an active economic development to attract new customers to the state. We recently cited as a top 20 utility in the area of economic development. And as we look at our load for 2021 compared to what our current projections are for 2020, we're seeing an increase in load of about 3%. So an increase in load compared to what we've experienced year to date with our projections for the balance of 2020. So we're seeing a rebound in load.
Certainly our hope that with the development of the vaccine, that all of us across the state will be getting back to a more normal pattern of living. And that will include the resumption of more normal operating conditions in manufacturing facilities across the state of Alabama, and likewise with commercial enterprises and residential customers as well. So that's
Yeah.
sort of.
But just to be clear, you're forecasting a decrease in load for the upcoming year.
Relative to what we filed in last year's budget, yes.
And so have you looked at the load effects beyond the next year?
Again, Bronson and I work in the financial planning area and support the Rsc filing in that way. We're really here to talk today about what's in the filing for 2021.
I guess I'll end on, so we're looking at, and I think the testimony was an increase of $4 per customer bill because of the operational rate RSC.
Typical residential bill, the estimate is $4.
And then last year we had an increase of $4 because of rate CMP. Is that correct?
No, last year actually was a decrease in rates CMPC.
Must have been the year before. Because of rate CMP.
Yeah, last year was a roughly $60 million decrease in CMPC.
Based on what we've looked at, customers, even with this rate increase, in January of 2021, will be paying less than what they were paying in rates in December of 2019. So if you factor in the CMPC decrease and these ECR actions and the RSC increase, all of that nets to a rate decrease relative to December of 2019, looking ahead to January of 2021.
So a rate decrease for January 2021?
The RSC rate will increase in January of 2021, and the ECR rate will decrease in January of 2021, resulting in a net 2% increase.
So a net 2% increase. And then we'll have, so there's 1.4 billion plant service this year.
There will be 1.4 billion of additional plant and service gross at the end of 2021 based on our current projections, but that will also include depreciation expense, which will in effect decrease the net plant increase.
It will decrease the net plant in service increase, what you're saying.
Correct. There will be a net plant increase, an increase in net plant for 2021.
And then with the new natural gas units coming online, we'll see more plant and service increases in 2022, 2023.
2023, I think, is when those are scheduled to come online.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you.
Anything from the company in the way of clarity or anything else you want to add?
No, sir, Your Honor.
All right, if not, that will conclude our informal meeting on the RSC filing for this year. Let's take about a 10-minute break and we'll come back and initiate the informal meeting for CMPC. We're off the record for 10 minutes.